The ink dried faster in winter. Isolde had learned that in her first year as a ritual scribe, the way the cold air pulled moisture from the page before the words had fully settled, leaving edges that feathered and blurred if she didn't move her hand quickly enough. She'd developed a slight tilt to her wrist to compensate. 3 years later, the adjustment was so ingrained she didn't think about it anymore. She thought about it now, standing on the elevated platform in the Great Hall, because thinking about ink was better than thinking about the man 20 feet away from her. The hall held 200 people. Lords and their retinues, pack representatives from 7 territories, healers, guards, attendants, and the usual cluster of court officials who attended the ritual of the living stone every year, whether they understood its purpose or not. Isolde had attended 4 times. She understood its purpose better than most of the lords. She'd transcribed the original documentation twice, cross-referenced it against records dating back 6 generations, and written the formal summary that sat in the restricted archive under Helwis's seal. The ritual was not complicated. The Alpha King placed both hands on the stone, channeled his energy through it, and the stone redistributed that energy outward through the territory's ley lines, reinforcing the protective compact that had held since the kingdom's founding. It took approximately 12 minutes. It had never gone wrong. Isolde pressed her quill to the page and noted the time. She kept her eyes on the parchment. This was not unusual. Scribes were not meant to watch the proceedings directly, only to record them, and Isolde had perfected the particular quality of attention that allowed her to document what happened in a room without appearing to observe anyone in it. It was a useful skill. It had kept her employed and unremarkable for 3 years in a court where unremarkable was the safest thing to be. What she could not account for, and had stopped trying to account for, was the specific awareness she carried whenever Aldrin was in the same room. It wasn't proximity. She'd stood near enough to other powerful shifters without feeling anything beyond the ordinary wariness that any person of common sense maintained around someone who could break a door with one hand. This was different. This was directional. A pull in the chest that oriented toward him the way a compass needle oriented toward north. Not violently, not dramatically, just steadily, and without asking her permission. She told herself it was the nature of his rank. The Alpha King was the highest authority in the shifter world, commanding not just his own pack, but every alpha beneath him across all territories. Of course, his presence registered differently. Of course, the body responded to that kind of power with something that felt like heightened attention. She'd been telling herself that for 8 months. Isolde noted the formal opening of the ritual proceedings and did not look up. What she couldn't explain away, what she had actively avoided examining, was the morning 4 months ago when she'd delivered her quarterly archive summary to the administrative office and been told the Alpha King had requested it be brought to him directly. Not to his secretary, not to his counsel, to him. She'd stood in his receiving room for approximately 3 minutes while he reviewed the document, and he hadn't spoken to her at all. And when she left, she'd stood in the corridor for a full minute before her hands stopped shaking. She'd attributed it to nerves. Anyone would be nervous. He had requested her reports directly 6 times since then. Isolde turned to a fresh page and noted the approach of the stone bearer. The living stone was carried to the platform on a cushioned frame by 4 attendants, a dense, dark object roughly the size of a man's head, faceted on one side and smooth on the other, with a faint internal luminescence that pulsed in a slow, even rhythm. Isolde had seen it up close once during an inventory of ritual objects 3 years ago. Up close, the pulse felt less like light and more like a heartbeat. She wrote, "Stone presented to the platform at the appointed hour. Condition consistent with prior records. No visible irregularities." She did not look at Aldrin. She heard him move. She always heard him move. Not because he was loud, he wasn't, but because her attention tracked him without her consent and translated every sound from his direction into information she hadn't asked for. The particular weight of his step on the stone platform. The absence of any sound from his attendants as he approached the stone, because no one spoke or shifted when he was concentrating. Isolde gripped her quill and kept her eyes down. The ritual began. She documented it in the formal language she'd been trained to use. Detached, precise, third person, no editorial commentary. The Alpha King approached the stone. The Alpha King placed his hands on the designated contact points. The luminescence increased in intensity, consistent with the initiation of the compact renewal. The stone pulsed once, strongly, and then the sound came first. Not an explosion, the way she'd imagined explosions from historical accounts. Not a single percussive crack, but a sustained tearing, as though the air itself was being pulled apart at the seams. Isolde's head came up without her deciding to raise it. The stone was fragmenting from the inside. She had time to see that. The cracks spreading outward from the core, the internal light turning wrong, too bright, too white, the attendants stumbling backward. And then the stone came apart, and the force of it moved through the platform like a wave through water. And Isolde was at the edge, and there was nothing behind her. She grabbed the edge with both hands as her body went over. The drop below was not darkness exactly. It was absence. She couldn't see the bottom because there wasn't one to see, just a depth that the eye refused to follow, a space that shouldn't exist inside a stone floor, and her hands on the rim of it, and her arms shaking with the effort of holding her own weight. Above her, the hall was chaos. Shouting, stone dust, the smell of something burnt. She couldn't see who was where. She could hear guards calling positions, and someone screaming, and the lower, more controlled voices of people trying to establish order in a situation that had no order to offer. No one came to the edge. The nearest guards had been thrown hard sideways by the blast, and the stone at the rim was still splitting in thin, hot lines that made everyone farther back hesitate a fraction too long. Isolde's fingers were slipping. The rim was stone, but the stone was warm in a way stone shouldn't be warm, faintly vibrating, and her grip was failing in increments she could track but couldn't stop. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his step, now urgent, crossing the platform toward her. Then his hands closed around her wrist and her forearm, and the grip was absolute, no question of whether it would hold. He pulled. She came up over the edge in one motion, and her knees hit the platform, and she was on solid ground with dust in her mouth and her heart doing something violent behind her ribs. She registered the warmth of his hands before anything else, the specific heat of them, the steadiness of the grip, even as she felt the slight tremor underneath it that wasn't effort, was something else, something she didn't have words for yet. Isolde looked up. He was close. Closer than he'd ever been. She'd seen his face from across rooms, in formal processions, in the receiving chamber where she'd stood with her submitted reports and kept her eyes appropriately lowered. She had not seen it like this. 2 feet away, level with hers, because he'd come down to the edge to reach her, dust on his jaw and a cut at his temple from stone fragments, and his eyes on her face with an expression she had never seen on him before and couldn't name. The green of his eyes was dark. Not the bright green of daylight, something deeper, more internal, like color seen through deep water. There was blood on his side, a spreading stain through his shirt that she registered the same moment he released her hands and straightened. "Are you?" she started. He stepped back. The step was wrong, too careful, too deliberate, the kind of deliberate that meant something was being managed. The fissure was still open behind her. She hadn't registered it in the moment of being pulled up, hadn't thought about it, and now she turned instinctively because she felt the edge of it at her back, the wrongness of that open space. Aldrin was closer to it than she'd realized. The pull of his movement toward her had carried him further than... She watched him go over. Not falling, not losing balance. The platform shuddered again, a secondary tremor from whatever had destroyed the stone, and his footing gave on the same cracked edge that had taken her, and there was no one close enough. The attendants were too far. The guards were oriented toward the exits. She was the only one looking at him. She reached. Her hand hit empty air. The fissure closed. The stone sealed itself as though it had never been open. The warm vibration stopped, and the platform was just a platform again, intact, covered in stone fragments and dust, and the debris of a ritual that had failed catastrophically, and Aldrin was not on it. No body, no indication of direction, no proof of anything. Isolde stood at the sealed edge of the fissure with her hand still extended and the room coming back into focus around her. The shouting, the guards converging, the lords demanding answers, Rolf's voice above the others, calm and carrying, already organizing the response with the particular efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this. She lowered her hand. Someone was asking her if she was injured. She answered without tracking what she said. A healer arrived, and she let them move her to the side of the platform, and she sat where they put her, and she watched Rolf direct the guards to seal the hall, watched him turn to the senior lords with his hands clasped, and his expression appropriately grave. She watched him, and she thought about the stone fragmenting from the inside, about cracks that spread outward from a core, about the way the force had moved through the platform at an angle that should have taken Aldrin before it took anyone else, given his position, about the fissure opening exactly where she'd been standing at the edge. She thought about those things, and she said nothing, because the hall was full of lords and guards and Rolf's people, and she was a scribe with ink-stained hands and no status worth accounting for. And Aldrin was gone, and she was the only person in the room who had seen his face in the moment before the platform gave way. The healers moved her again. She let them. Her parchment was still in her hand. She'd held onto it through all of it, through the fall and the grip and the tremor, the ingrained habit of the trained archivist refusing to release a document even when the world came apart. She looked down at it. The last line she'd written before the explosion read, "No visible irregularities." She turned the page over and stared at the blank side. 3 days later, she woke in a room she didn't recognize, in a bed with clean linens and shuttered windows and a candle burned down to its last inch. Her throat was dry. Her hands were bandaged. She hadn't noticed the cuts from the rim until now. She'd been saying something before she came fully awake. Her mouth was still shaped around the end of it, a word or a name, something that had started in sleep and arrived in waking without its beginning. She couldn't recover it. It sat at the edge of her tongue like a word in a language she'd never learned, present and unreachable. She sat up in the unfamiliar bed, in the unfamiliar room, with bandaged hands and someone else's clothes, and outside the shuttered window, the city sounded wrong. Too tense, too quiet in some registers and too loud in others, the particular acoustic signature of a place where something had broken and no one had decided yet what shape the pieces would take. Isolde pressed her bandaged palms flat against the clean linens. She was still holding the image of his face, the closeness of it, the blood on his side and the green of his eyes and the deliberate wrongness of that last step, the way the fissure had closed, as though it had always been a floor. She kept turning it over, the way she turned over documents that didn't add up, not trying to reach a conclusion yet, just cataloging, just holding each detail in its place until the shape of what they made together became visible. The candle went out. She sat in the dark and cataloged and waited, and did not let herself think about the word her sleeping mouth had been forming when she woke. The pain started on the second day, not the cuts on her hands. Those were clean wounds, tended properly, healing in the ordinary way of ordinary injuries. This was different. This lived in the center of her chest, between her sternum and her spine, a pressure that had no physical cause Isolde could identify. She'd pressed her fingers against it the first morning, searching for a bruised rib, a pulled muscle, something that explained the sensation. Nothing. The healers who checked on her twice daily found nothing either. They used the word stress, with the careful neutrality of people who meant something else and couldn't say it. By the fourth day, she'd stopped mentioning it. The room was comfortable. That was the thing she kept returning to. The quality of the discomfort was so at odds with the quality of the room. Clean linens changed every other day. A window that, when she opened the shutters against instruction, showed a courtyard she didn't recognize, belonging to a building she couldn't place in her mental map of the capital. Good food brought by attendants who answered her questions about their names and their duties, and nothing else. A door that was, when she tried it quietly on the third night, locked from the outside. She'd stood at that locked door for a moment and then gone back to bed, because making noise about it would only accelerate whatever was coming. And she wanted to understand the situation before she did anything that couldn't be undone. What she understood so far: the kingdom had not declared mourning. She'd listened carefully to every sound from outside and to everything the attendants didn't say, and there had been no bells, no formal silence, no change in the acoustic register of the city that she associated with death rites. Which meant Aldrin had not been declared dead. Which meant either his body had been recovered and the declaration was pending, or no body had been found and no one knew what to do with the absence. She knew which one it was. She'd been in that hall. She'd watched the fissure close. There was no body to find. What she also understood: she was being kept here, comfortable and locked, by someone with enough authority to commandeer a building in the capital and assign healers and attendants, and enough practical sense to not explain why. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. On the 6th morning, Helwys came. Isolde heard her before the door opened. The particular cadence of her walk, the slight drag of her left heel that had been there for as long as Isolde had known her, the product of an old injury Helwys had never explained and Isolde had never asked about. When the door opened, Isolde was already sitting up. Helwys looked the same as she always looked, white hair pinned with aggressive precision, eyes the color of winter sky, the expression of someone who had decided what needed to be done and had organized her feelings about it into a compartment that wouldn't be opened until the task was finished. She was alone. The door closed behind her. She crossed to the chair by the window and sat down without being asked, and looked at Isolde with an assessment that lasted approximately 4 seconds. "You look better than I expected," Helwys said. "I've been sleeping," Isolde said. "There isn't much else to do." Helwys's gaze moved to the door, then back. She had perhaps 10 minutes. She spent none of them on preamble. The court was fracturing. Rolf had convened an emergency session of the senior council within hours of the ritual's failure, and had spent every day since building the case for a formal declaration of vacancy. His position was that the Alpha King was gone, no body, no confirmation of survival, no communication, and that the longer the throne remained in a state of unresolved succession, the greater the risk of territorial instability. He used the word instability, the way experienced politicians used all their most important words, often and in varied contexts, until it meant whatever the room needed it to mean. The opposition to Rolf was genuine, but disorganized. 4 of the senior lords believed Aldrin was alive or recoverable. 3 were waiting to see which way the wind settled before committing to a position. 2 were openly aligned with Rolf and had been since before the ritual, which Helwys noted with the specific flatness of someone who found the timing meaningful. "What does Rolf actually want?" Isolde asked. "He can't take the throne. He's not of the line. He doesn't want the throne." Helwys folded her hands in her lap. "He wants the kingdom divided. There are 3 territories that would function as independent holdings under lords loyal to him if the central authority collapsed. The throne would go to Cowen, Aldrin's second cousin, 17 years old, no political experience, and the kind of temperament that does well under strong guidance. Cowen. Isolde filed the name. "So Rolf manages the boy and runs 3 territories outright. That's the shape of it." The pressure in Isolde's chest shifted slightly. Not better, not worse, just different, the way a wound sometimes moved when the body changed position. She pressed her hand against it briefly and stopped when she noticed Helwys watching. "The healers say they can't find a cause," Isolde said. "No," Helwys agreed. "They wouldn't." She paused. "There's a man coming to see you today. His name is Erwin. He served directly under Aldrin. I'd listen carefully to what he tells you." "About what?" "About what you're feeling." Helwys stood. She had the look of someone arranging words in a specific order, choosing each one. "What happened to you on that platform, the thing he pulled you back from? It left something behind. Erwin will explain it better than I can. I'm telling you so you don't reject the explanation before you've heard it." She paused at the door. He's not your enemy, Isolde. In the current count of people who are not your enemy, he matters. Why am I locked in? Because Rolf's people have been asking questions about who was standing at the edge of the fissure when it closed. Helwis's hand was on the door. You are the only witness whose account contradicts his version of events. Your version is that Aldrin fell into the fissure. His version is that Aldrin was killed by an external attack and the body taken. He needs his version to hold. A brief pause. In the first minutes, with stone dust thick in the air and half the hall shouting contradictory accounts, it was an easy lie to plant. The locked door is inconvenient. It is also the only reason you're still here to be inconvenienced by it. She left. The door locked again from the outside. Isolde sat with that for a while. She thought about contradicting accounts and what it meant that she had one. She thought about Rolf's timing in the immediate aftermath of the ritual. The calm, the preparation, the particular readiness of a man who had organized a response before there was a situation to respond to. She thought about the stone fragmenting from the inside, about cracks that began at the core. She got up and went to the window and looked at the courtyard she didn't recognize and thought about the fact that she was the only person in that hall who had seen Aldrin's face in the moment before the fissure closed. Erwin arrived 2 hours later. He was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't examined what she was expecting closely enough to say exactly what she'd anticipated instead. He was perhaps 35, broad across the shoulders, with the contained quality of movement that marked shifters who had spent years learning not to use their full range in human spaces. Red-brown hair, close cut. Eyes that moved around the room before they settled on her, cataloging exits and positions with the automatic habit of someone who'd been doing it so long they no longer noticed. He sat in the same chair Helwis had used and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Helwis said you'd explain what I'm feeling, Isolde said. She decided while waiting that she would not perform patience she didn't have. The pain in my chest. What is it? Erwan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He didn't look like someone building to a revelation. He looked like someone delivering information he wished he could deliver differently, but had decided that bluntness served better than construction. It's a mate bond, he said. Incomplete. You're human, so you're experiencing the physical symptoms without the full context. The pain is the bond responding to Aldrin's absence. Isolde looked at him. She had read about mate bonds. She had transcribed historical accounts of them, documented their role in pack succession law, cataloged the legal framework around contested claims and bond disputes going back 4 generations. She understood the concept with the thorough, detached competence of someone who had studied a thing extensively from the outside. Understanding a thing extensively from the outside was, it turned out, not the same as sitting in a locked room with a pain in her chest being told it had a name. I'm human, she said. It happens, rarely. The bond doesn't sort by species. He said it matter-of-factly without apology or emphasis. It recognized you. That's what it does. It recognizes. The rest follows. The rest, she repeated. The pull. The awareness. The difficulty being in the same room without your attention orienting toward him. He watched her carefully. You've been feeling it for a while. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. His expression said he didn't need her to. He knew, Erwan said. Before the ritual, he'd known for several months. He held her gaze steadily. The reports, the direct requests. Isolde was quiet for a moment. The pressure in her chest had changed quality again. Not softer, not sharper, something else. Something that was going to need time to resolve itself into a single clear emotion. And she didn't have time right now, so she set it aside with the deliberate care of someone setting down something fragile on an unstable surface. He knew and said nothing, she said. The situation is complicated for a king. And now he's gone. Yes. Into the fissure. The thing that everyone official is saying didn't happen. Yes. Erwin's voice didn't shift. Which is part of why you're here and why the door is locked and why what you do next matters considerably. The pressure in Isolde's chest was constant. She'd been trying not to focus on it directly, the way you avoided looking straight at a dim light that was easier to see in peripheral vision. Now she let herself feel it fully for one moment. The weight of it, the directionality of it, the way it oriented towards somewhere she couldn't follow. He had known for months and said nothing, and she had told herself for months that it was nerves, that it was rank, that it was the ordinary response of an ordinary person to an extraordinary proximity. And apparently both of them had been engaged in the same exercise of determined misattribution for the better part of a year. That thought belonged in the compartment with everything else that needed time she didn't have. "What did you want to tell me?" she asked. Past the explanation, Erwan sat back slightly. "Rolf is moving to transfer you out of the capital within 2 days. He can't have your account in circulation while he's building the vacancy case. Once you're transferred, controlling where you go and who you speak to becomes much simpler for him. So I have 2 days. Less, possibly. And you're telling me this because you want to move me before he does. I'm telling you this because you're a witness whose testimony could complicate Rolf's case considerably, and because you are—" He stopped, started again. "Because you may be the only person in the kingdom with a specific capability that becomes relevant depending on what we find in the restricted archives." "What capability?" "I don't know yet." He said it with the directness of someone who found honesty more efficient than confidence they hadn't earned. "I have a direction. I need someone who can read old archival language. Your name is at the top of a very short list." Isolde stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the unfamiliar courtyard. She thought about Helwys saying, "The count of people who are not your enemy," with the careful emphasis of someone who had done the count and found it short. She thought about Aldrin's face, 2 feet from hers in the dust and chaos of the platform. The specific expression she still hadn't found a name for. She thought about the bond she hadn't known was a bond, pulling toward a direction that was now the absence of a direction. "When?" she asked. "Tonight," Erwan said, "before the transfer order is processed." She turned around. "Helwys stays behind? She'll maintain her position in the archives. We need access to remain possible." Isolde looked at him for a moment. At the steady, pragmatic set of his expression, at the absence of performance in it, the quality of a man who was not trying to convince her of his trustworthiness because he'd decided that was her assessment to make, and he would simply provide the information required to make it. "All right," she said. They left that night. Through the courtyard she'd been studying from the window for 6 days. The capital sounded the same as it had every night, tense, watchful, suspended in the particular state of a city that was waiting to find out what it had lost. Isolde walked with her bandaged hands tucked into her sleeves and the pain in her chest steady and constant and oriented, as always, towards somewhere she couldn't reach. She didn't look back at the building. Ahead of her, Erwan moved through the narrow streets with the quiet assurance of someone who had mapped this route before he'd needed it, and Isolde matched his pace, and the city fell behind them, and somewhere that she couldn't name or find or touch, a bond she hadn't chosen pulled taut against the distance and held. The farmhouse was 3 hours from the capital by horse, set back from the road behind a tree line dense enough to swallow sound. Erwan had not told her who owned it. Isolde had not asked. There were questions that belonged to the first week of a situation and questions that belonged to later, when the shape of things had clarified enough to make the answers useful. She had been here 11 days. The first 3 she'd spent recovering from the ride, not from physical exhaustion, though that was real enough, but from the particular depletion of sustained alertness. The constant management of the locked room, the careful listening, the performance of compliance while she catalogued and assessed, it had cost more than she'd tracked while it was happening. She slept long and woke slowly, and let herself do both without apology. By the 4th day, she was restless. By the 5th, she had organized the farmhouse's small shelf of records and maintenance documents by date and subject purely out of reflex, and Erwan had looked at the result without commenting. He was gone for long stretches, riding back toward the capital and returning with saddlebags that grew heavier each trip. He didn't explain where he went or who he spoke to. He brought food, supplies, and documents, the documents stacked on the farmhouse table in increasing quantities until Isolde had to move her candle twice to find clear space. He also brought news, delivered with the same pragmatic flatness he used for everything. Rolf had presented his vacancy motion formally. The senior council had not yet voted. 3 lords who had been undecided were reportedly moving toward Rolf's position, which meant he was close to the threshold he needed. The timeline Erwan had initially estimated was compressing. Kawen, the 17-year-old second cousin, had been brought to the capital quietly. Isolde had filed that detail in the same place she'd filed everything else about Rolf's preparations, in the growing column of things that had been arranged before there was officially anything to arrange. The pain in her chest was constant. She had stopped trying to manage it and started simply living alongside it, the way she imagined one learned to live alongside any chronic condition that had no available remedy. Acknowledgement without accommodation, presence without permission. It was always there. Some hours it was quieter. Some hours, usually around the middle of the night, it sharpened into something she had to breathe through carefully until it eased. Erwan had noticed. He hadn't mentioned it again after the first night, when she'd been sitting at the table at the second hour past midnight and he'd come downstairs and looked at her and said nothing, just put a cup of water near her hand and gone back to the stairs and stopped there without going up. "Does it mean he's alive?" she'd asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. "A bond this established doesn't break quietly," he'd said. "If it had broken, you would know." She had thought about that for a long time after he went upstairs. On the 8th day, Erwan arrived with the largest collection of documents yet, and set them on the table with a look that meant they had reached the part of the situation where her particular skills became the point. "These are copies," he said. "Helwys made them. The originals are in the restricted archive under the archive keeper's seal." Isolde looked at the stack. Some pages were recent copies of older documents. She could tell by the fresh ink on aged layouts, the particular formatting of records that predated the current cataloging system by at least 2 centuries. Some were in the dense, abbreviated script that archivists used for internal reference, a notation system that looked like a foreign language to anyone not trained in it, and was, functionally, exactly that. "What are we looking for?" she asked. "The void," Erwan said. "Specifically, what it is, how it was made, and whether anything has ever come back out of it." Isolde sat down. She had been waiting for this question since the farmhouse. She had known it was coming the way she knew a document was incomplete before she reached the end. Not from a specific missing piece, but from the cumulative shape of what was present and the space that shape left unfilled. "You think he's still in there?" she said. "I think it's possible." Erwan sat across from her. The void opened during the ritual. The ritual involves the compact between the Alpha King and the territory. There are historical precedents for compact-related artifacts behaving unexpectedly when subjected to interference. Some of those records are in what Helwys copied. He paused. "I'm not an archivist. I can read standard script. What's in those pages is not standard script." Isolde pulled the stack toward her. She worked through the rest of that day, and into the night, the candle moved twice more for space, and once for light. Erwan sat at the other end of the table, reading what he could and setting aside what he couldn't. And the farmhouse was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and the fire settling. She found the first relevant entry near the bottom of the 4th document, a record from the reign of the second Alpha King, written in the restricted notation of a chief archivist who had been, based on internal cross-references, also a compact scholar. The notation was dense and used 3 abbreviations she had to decode from context, but the substance of it was clear enough once she'd worked through the surface layer. The void was not a natural feature. It had been constructed. She read the passage 3 times to be certain she was translating the archival shorthand correctly, then set the page flat on the table and looked at it. "It was built," she said. Erwan looked up. "By the founding line. The first Alpha King and his compact scholars." She kept her finger on the passage. "It's a confinement space, not a pit, a constructed space between the physical territory and whatever is outside it. The record calls it a threshold chamber. It was built to hold things that couldn't be executed and couldn't be permitted to remain in the territory." She paused. People. It was built to hold people. Alive? Alive. She moved to the next page. The confinement is maintained by the compact. The same compact the ritual was renewing. While the compact holds, the threshold chamber holds. While the threshold chamber holds, anyone inside it stays inside. She looked up. The record is explicit about one other point. Confinement preserves the body from ordinary decline while the compact remains active. Hunger is felt. Exhaustion accumulates. But the chamber does not permit its subjects to die by neglect alone. The stone was the physical anchor for the compact. When it was destroyed, the threshold chamber lost its anchor, Erwan said. It didn't collapse, it destabilized. She was reading ahead, translating as she went. A destabilized threshold chamber maintains its structure but loses its entrance seal. The fissure, that's what the fissure was, the seal failing. An opening. Erwan was very still. So he didn't fall into a void, he said. He fell into a room. A room with no light, no time reference, no physical comfort and no exit, yes. She turned another page. But a room. She kept reading. Erwan didn't speak, which she had come to recognize as his version of urgency, the quality of attention that kept itself very quiet in order not to interrupt. The records on the threshold chamber were fragmentary. Whoever had maintained them had done so inconsistently, and at least 2 entries had been partially damaged by what appeared to be water exposure at some point in the archive's history. She worked through what remained with the focused patience of someone who had spent 3 years reconstructing incomplete documents and knew that gaps were information too. That the shape of what was missing told you something about who had decided it should be missing. The entry she found in the 7th document stopped her completely. It was a personal record, not an official one, written in standard script, not archival notation, by someone who had not been trained to write without a first person. The archivist's seal at the top identified the writer as Maud, chief archivist in the reign of the 4th Alpha King. The entry was dated to the 3rd year of that reign. Maud had written about a woman named Paris who had been confined to the threshold chamber on a charge of compact violation and had, 3 weeks after confinement, returned. Isolde read the entry twice. "There's a record of someone coming back," she said. Erwan leaned forward. "A woman, 3 weeks after confinement." She kept her eyes on the page. Maud writes that she emerged at the site of the original fissure. But the stone had been replaced by then, the compact restored, the fissure resealed. She shouldn't have been able to emerge. But she did. She did, and Maud interviewed her. Isolde turned the page. Maud writes that the woman described the threshold chamber as a reflected space, visually identical to the castle as it existed at the moment she entered, but static. No movement, no light changes, no time passing, but the awareness of time passing somewhere else. She paused, and she described carrying something back with her. Maud uses the term threshold remnant, a fragment of the chamber's construction that had transferred to her during confinement. "How did she get out?" Erwan asked. Isolde reached the end of the entry. "Maud doesn't know," she said. Paris couldn't explain it clearly. She described feeling pulled, a sustained directional pull that intensified over the 3 weeks until she followed it to what had been the fissure location, and the chamber released her. The farmhouse was very quiet. Isolde set the page down and looked at her hands, flat on the table. The bandages had come off 4 days ago. The cuts from the rim of the fissure had healed into thin lines across her palms and the undersides of her fingers, the particular topography of having held on as hard as she could. She thought about directional pulls, about the way the mate bond oriented her whether she consented to be oriented or not, about what Erwan had said. A bond this established doesn't break quietly, and the specific comfort she had not admitted finding in that statement. "The pull Paris felt," Erwan said slowly, "the sustained directional sensation that intensified over weeks. I don't know that it's the same mechanism," Isolde said. "You don't know that it isn't." She looked at him. The mate bond is a compact in its own right, he said. Not an official one, not a constructed one, but structurally, it functions as a connection between two people that persists regardless of distance or circumstance. He paused carefully. You were touching the fissure when it was open. Your hands were on the rim of an active threshold chamber while Aldrin was in contact with it from the other side. If anything transferred, a threshold remnant, she said. I'm speculating. So am I. She pulled the stack of documents back toward her. Let me finish reading. She worked through the rest of the night. Erwan fell asleep in the chair at the other end of the table, sometime past the 3rd hour, and she let him, because the remaining documents required full concentration and she worked better without the awareness of being watched. The dream started that night for the first time. She hadn't slept. She was certain of that. Certain she had been awake and reading when it happened, though afterward she couldn't account for the gap between one page and the next. Between one moment and the one that followed it, she was somewhere else. Not a location. A state. Dark without being darkness. Silent without being silence. And in it, not a figure, not a clear shape, something that pressed against the edges of the space the way a sound pressed against a wall before it became audible. Directional. Insistent. Not toward her, but not away from her. Moving against a boundary she couldn't see. Then she turned the page, and the candle had burned down a full inch, and the page in her hand was one she hadn't read yet. She sat still for a moment. Then she noted the page number, noted the approximate time, and kept reading. It happened again before morning, the same gap, the same directionless dark, the same pressure against a boundary. Shorter this time. She came back to herself, still holding her place in the document, and with the acute certainty that whatever was on the other side of that boundary had not known she was there. That last part was important. She didn't know why yet, but she filed it carefully, the way she filed details that didn't fit the current shape of the evidence and waited for the shape to change. When Erwan woke, she had the documents organized into 3 categories: confirmed information, probable inference, and speculation requiring additional records. She had a list of questions for the additional records that she'd written in archival notation out of habit, and had to rewrite in standard script so he could read them. She pushed both lists across the table to him. The threshold chamber can be re-entered, she said. Not physically. The record describes it as a partial entry, a projection. Someone on the outside extending into the threshold space without fully crossing into it. She kept her voice level and informational. The threshold remnant that Maud describes, if I'm carrying something like it, a fragment from the contact at the fissure, it would function as an access point. A way in that doesn't require the fissure to be open. Erwan read the list without speaking. The stone needs to be rebuilt first, she continued. The compact needs a physical anchor, or the threshold chamber destabilizes further. A further destabilized chamber. She paused. There are records of threshold chambers collapsing entirely when the compact was severed for too long. Maud's records don't specify the threshold for that. How long has it been? Erwan asked. 20 days. He looked up from the lists. Then we need the stone rebuilt, she said. And we need evidence against Rolf, strong enough to prevent him from stopping us before the rebuilding is complete. A brief pause. Outside, the early morning moved through the trees without urgency, indifferent to the conversation at the farmhouse table. Helwys sent a message this morning, Erwan said. Rolf is accelerating the vacancy vote. He's calling it for 4 days from now. Isolde looked at the organized documents, at the 2 lists in her own handwriting, at the thin lines on her palms where the rim of the fissure had cut into her skin less than 3 weeks ago. Then we go back to the capital, she said. The capital had changed in less than 3 weeks. Isolde noticed it in the quality of the streets before she noticed it in anything specific. The way people moved, slightly faster than usual, slightly more directed, the particular efficiency of a city that had stopped browsing and started preparing. Market stalls were still open. Guards were still at their posts. On the surface, nothing had failed. Underneath, something had shifted in the weight that people carried when they walked. Erwan had arranged entry through a trade gate on the eastern side, tucked behind a wool merchant's depot that apparently owed him a favor he hadn't explained. They arrived before dawn and were inside a building 2 streets from the archive quarter before the city had fully woken. The building was a narrow townhouse, occupied on the upper floors by a beta from Erwan's network, whose name Isolde was not given. She didn't need it. She needed the ground floor table, the light from the south-facing window, and the documents Helwys had prepared to send ahead. They were waiting when she arrived. Helwys had organized them with the precise economy of someone who had very little time and did not intend to waste any of it. Cover page, index, primary records, secondary cross-references. A note at the top in Helwys's compressed handwriting that said only, "Access authorization records, vault inventory, third shelf, eastern wall. The irregularities are in the language." Isolde sat down and started reading. The vault, the sealed storage that housed the ritual objects between ceremonies, had a strictly maintained access log. Every entry required 2 authorizations, both recorded in the log with date, time, purpose, and the signatures of both authorizing parties. It had functioned this way for 60 years without a recorded deviation. The log was considered one of the most reliable documents in the archive precisely because its format was unchanging and its requirements were structural, not discretionary. She found the irregularity in the 43rd entry from the current year. The entry was for a routine maintenance inspection, 3 weeks before the ritual. Both signatures were present. The date and time were recorded. The purpose notation was in standard format. On first reading, it was indistinguishable from any other entry in the log. Isolde had not spent 3 years in the archive reading documents that needed to be indistinguishable from other documents without learning what indistinguishability cost the person creating it. The second signature was Rolf's. Senior Counselor Authorization, standard for this class of vault access. His signature appeared 14 times in the log across the past 4 years. She'd counted. And in each prior instance, he used the same specific ligature between the rar and the u of his name, a slight forward lean that was distinct enough to function almost as a personal mark. In the 43rd entry, the ligature was absent. The letters were the same. The pressure of the quill was the same. The angle was the same. But the ligature, the small habitual connection between 2 letters that a person didn't think about because they'd written their own name thousands of times, and the movement was as automatic as breathing, was absent. Someone had copied Rolf's signature without having watched him write it enough times to catch that detail. Or, and this was the part that made the entry useful rather than merely suspicious, someone had written the entry and forged the signature in a hurry, under conditions where they couldn't verify the copy against a recent original, and had produced something that was almost correct and not quite. Isolde put the page aside and picked up the next. She worked through the morning with Erwan sitting across from her, reading what he could and waiting on what he couldn't. The townhouse was quieter than the farmhouse had been. The sounds of the city outside were a constant background presence, the specific noise of a place that was trying to function normally and not entirely succeeding. The second piece of evidence was less subtle. The vault maintenance record, the internal document created during the inspection itself, separate from the access log, contained a notation in the column for object condition assessments. Every ritual object had a condition entry: current state, comparison to previous inspection, any notable changes. For the living stone, the condition entry read, stable, consistent with prior assessment, no visible changes. The notation was dated to the inspection 3 weeks before the ritual. The notation was in Rolf's handwriting. Not copied. Isolde had enough samples of his actual writing from council records to be confident. He had been there. He had personally assessed the stone and recorded its condition as unchanged. The stone had not been unchanged. Whatever had been introduced to its core to cause it to fragment on contact with the Alpha King's energy had been introduced before that inspection, or during it, and Rolf had either failed to notice or had chosen to record a condition that was not the condition he observed. The second option required him to have known what he was recording over. Isolde set that page beside the first and looked at what she had. a forged authorization signature for the vault access that had preceded the inspection. A condition notation in Rolf's own hand recording a stable object that had been demonstrably not stable. Neither piece alone was conclusive. Together, they described a man who had arranged access to the ritual object through a forged authorization, had personally overseen whatever was done to it, and had then documented a false condition to create a record showing nothing had been done. "I have two pieces," she told Erwin. "The forged signature on the access authorization and his own handwriting on the false condition record." She pushed both pages across the table. "The forged signature proves unauthorized access to the vault before the ritual. His condition record proves he was present and documented something he knew was false." Erwan examined both pages. He had the focused stillness of someone running probabilities rather than looking for reassurance. "Is it enough to present to the council?" she asked. "It's enough to demand an investigation before the vacancy vote." He set the pages down. "If the vote is delayed, Rolf's assembled support starts to fragment. 3 of the lords backing him are opportunists, not loyalists. They'll wait and see rather than commit to a losing position." He paused. "The question is whether we can get these in front of the right lords before Rolf moves the vote." "Helois can get to Lord Auden," Isolde said. "He was the most vocal against the vacancy motion. If he has these and understands what they mean, he needs more than what they mean. He needs chain of custody, proof that these came from the archive and weren't produced by someone with motive to fabricate them." Erwan looked at her. "You need to be there when he receives them. Your credentials and your testimony about what you observed in the archive are what make them credible." Isolde thought about that. About walking into a senior lord's chambers as a 24-year-old scribe with ink-stained hands and presenting evidence of a senior counselor's conspiracy. About what happened to people who made that kind of presentation and turned out to be wrong, and what happened to the people behind them who had helped them make it. She thought about Helois, still inside the castle, creating bureaucratic obstruction that could not be invisible forever. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Helois will arrange the meeting." He stood. "Tonight you rest. The ritual preparation starts tomorrow evening." The ritual. She had known it was coming. Had known, since the farmhouse, that the evidence and the ritual were 2 parallel tracks that had to run simultaneously, that stopping Rolf and retrieving Aldrin were not sequential problems, but concurrent ones. She had organized her thinking around it. She had read everything Maud's record said about partial entry and threshold remnants, and the mechanics of extending into the chamber space without crossing entirely into it. She understood the theory, with the comprehensive detachment she'd developed for understanding things that were not comfortable to understand. She did not know what it would feel like to reach into the threshold chamber. She did not know if the remnant she carried was what Maud's records described. She did not know, specifically and concretely, what it cost the person attempting partial entry, because Maud's record described Paris returning through a mechanism that was involuntary, not deliberate. And the deliberately initiated version was not documented anywhere in what she'd been able to access. That uncertainty she filed separately from the theoretical understanding. Both were real. They just occupied different parts of the problem. She ate the meal that was left for her on the townhouse table, went to the narrow room assigned to her, and lay down without expecting to sleep. The dream came almost immediately. It was the same as before. Not a location, not a clear space, but a state, and within the state the directionless pressing of something against a boundary. Closer this time. The same pressure she'd felt in the farmhouse, but with a quality she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't been able to notice with the farmhouse drafts and the documents in her hands and the candle burning down. A quality that was specific. That was the only word she had for it. Not the general resistance of something pushing outward, but something with a particular shape and weight pushing in a particular way, distinguishable from a generalized force. She stayed with it this time instead of surfacing. It took effort. The instinct was to come back to the room, to the familiar weight of her own body and the predictable surface of the mattress. She let the instinct register and didn't follow it. The pressing continued. The boundary held. And then, briefly, incompletely, for less time than it would take to draw a full breath. She had the sense that the thing on the other side of the boundary had changed the quality of its attention. She surfaced. The room was dark. Her hands were flat against the mattress, the thin lines on her palms pressed into the coarse fabric. She lay still and thought carefully about what she had and had not just experienced, and whether the distinction between what she hoped and what she'd perceived was as clear as it needed to be. She decided she didn't know. She decided that not knowing and proceeding anyway was a state she was going to have to become comfortable with, because the alternative was waiting for certainty she would not receive. She slept the rest of the night without dreaming. The meeting with Lord Auden was at the second hour past dawn in his private receiving room, small and cold, and lit by a fire that had been burning recently enough to still be building heat. Auden was 60, heavy-set, with the look of a man who had been in enough councils to recognize what someone looked like when they were giving him real information, versus what someone looked like when they were giving him what they hoped he'd believe. He looked at Isolde for a long moment before she'd said anything, with the particular assessment of a senior lord trying to decide what category of person had been brought into his receiving room. She put the access log page and the condition record on the table in front of him and explained what she'd found and how she'd found it, and what chain of custody the documents carried. She used the same voice she used to give archive presentations. Informational, direct, no performance of urgency, because the facts contained urgency without her assistance. Auden read both pages. He asked 4 questions. She answered all 4. He asked one follow-up about the ligature specifically, the detail she'd flagged in the forged signature, and she explained the methodology that had identified it and the sample size she'd compared it against. He sat back and looked at the documents for a while. "The vote is in 2 days," he said. "Yes. If I call for an investigation on the basis of these records, Rolf will argue I'm acting on fabricated evidence produced by a witness with motive to discredit him." "Yes," Isolde said. "So you'll need to examine the original log yourself. The original is in the archive. Helwis will provide access this morning." Auden looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. "You've organized this considerably. I'm an archivist. It's what we do." He looked at the documents once more. Then he called for his secretary. Isolde left the meeting with the specific lightness of someone who had just shifted weight from one set of hands to another. The evidence was placed. Whether Auden moved on it and how fast, and whether Helwis could hold Rolf's bureaucratic process long enough, those were no longer her pieces to manage. Her piece was the ritual. Tonight, she went back to the townhouse and found Erwin already preparing. The components Maud's records had described, assembled with the careful attention of someone who was working from instructions in a language he couldn't fully read and was relying on a translator who was about to have other things to concentrate on. She checked his preparations against her notes and found one error, a placement that Maud's notation suggested should be oriented toward the site of the original fissure, not toward the center of the room. She corrected it. Erwan accepted the correction without commentary. They worked until the preparations were complete, and then Isolde sat at the table and looked at what they'd built and let herself feel, for the first time since the farmhouse, the full weight of what she was about to do. Not the theory, not the methodology, the actual event, reaching into a threshold chamber and finding someone inside it and asking that someone to hold on while she pulled, with nothing but a fragment she couldn't see and a bond she hadn't chosen, and a set of records from an archivist 200 years dead that described one involuntary return and offered no guidance on the deliberate version. The pressure in her chest was steady, oriented. It had been pointing the same direction for 22 days, and it had not weakened, and she had been telling herself that was evidence, and she had been right to tell herself that. And tonight, she was going to find out if the evidence held. She looked at the preparations on the floor, and she took a breath. "I'm ready," she said. The ritual began in silence. Erwan had cleared the ground floor of the townhouse entirely. Furniture moved to the walls, the central space open, the preparations laid out according to Maud's records in the arrangement Isolde had corrected that afternoon. A ring of materials anchored to 4 points, each point aligned with a direction that Maud's notation specified without explaining. The original fissure site was northeast of their current position. The northeast anchor was the strongest, weighted with the largest fragment of reconstructed stone that Erwin had been able to source. It was not a full ceremonial replacement. Maud's notes suggested they needed only a functional anchor, enough restored lattice for the compact to recognize itself and close the circuit for a single passage. Isolde stood in the center of the ring. She had read the instructions enough times that she no longer needed to consult her notes. She knew what the next 12 minutes were supposed to involve. She knew what the partial entry was theoretically supposed to feel like, based on Maud's second-hand account of Paris describing the reverse of the process. She knew what she was carrying in her palms. She couldn't see it, couldn't prove it, but she knew the way she knew the ligature in Rolf's signature, the way she knew the difference between a document that was complete and one that only looked complete. What she did not know was what Aldrin would find when she reached the boundary from this side. She closed her eyes. The mate bond had been with her for 22 days as a directionality, a pull, a compass function she could feel but not describe to anyone who hadn't felt it. She had been treating it as a symptom, something happening to her, something she managed and catalogued and lived alongside without asking it to do anything. She stopped managing it. The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not a surge or a flood. None of the language she associated with bond descriptions in the historical accounts she'd read, which had all been written by people who found the experience either too large or too intimate to render plainly. It was quieter than that. It was the difference between watching a fire and putting your hands near it. The heat had always been there. She had been standing at a careful distance. She stopped standing at a careful distance. The bond oriented, as it always did, northeast, toward the original fissure site, toward the threshold chamber, toward whatever was 22 days into confinement in a space with no light and no time and no exit. She followed the orientation instead of simply registering it, and the sensation was not pain. It was a different thing entirely, a reaching that extended beyond the boundary of her own body, the way sound extended beyond the instrument that made it. The threshold remnant responded. She felt it in her palms first, the thin lines of the cuts that had healed into a different quality of skin, faintly warm in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Then it moved upward through her hands and her arms and settled in her chest alongside the bond, and the two things, the remnant and the bond, aligned with each other the way two voices aligned when they found the same note. The room changed, not visually. She opened her eyes, and the townhouse was still the townhouse, the preparations on the floor still visible, Erwin still at the perimeter of the ring, watching with the controlled stillness of someone who had committed to not interfering unless something went wrong in a way he could identify. The room was the same, but there was a layer underneath it now that hadn't been accessible before, a second surface beneath the first. The threshold chamber reflected against the space she occupied, not present the way physical things were present, but present the way a sound was present in the wall it passed through, changed but not gone. She reached toward the northeast point and pushed. The boundary gave. It was not easy. Maud's records had not suggested it would be easy, and Maud had been accurate. The boundary resisted with the particular resistance of a constructed thing that had been built to hold, and the pressure of holding against it required the full focus of the bond and the remnant simultaneously, which required her to stop doing anything else, stop managing, stop the peripheral attention she usually maintained on her own functioning, and simply push. She pushed, and the threshold chamber came into contact with her. It was the reflected space that the farmhouse dreams had given her fragments of. The same castle geometry, but static, lightless, silent in a way that had weight to it rather than simply an absence of sound. She was not inside it. She was at its edge, her feet in the townhouse and her attention in the threshold space, holding the boundary open by the force of two things she couldn't see. She moved her attention through the space, not searching. She didn't need to search. The bond was still orienting, still pointing, and she followed it the way she'd been following it for 22 days, except that now following it had a destination instead of a direction. She found him in what would have been the Great Hall. He was on the floor, seated against the base of the platform, knees up, one arm resting across them. He had the look of someone who had stopped moving, and not because he'd decided to stop. The particular stillness of exhaustion that had settled into a posture and stayed there because the alternative required resources that weren't currently available. His hair was loose, falling past his jaw. His shirt was still marked by the stone fragments from 3 weeks ago. Dark stains she didn't examine closely. His eyes were open. He saw her the moment her attention reached him. Not a gradual awareness, not a slow focus, but an immediate full attention response. The wolf in him reaching toward her contact before the rest of him had fully processed what it was. He was on his feet before she registered that he'd moved, and then he stopped, and he looked at her with the expression she hadn't been able to name on the platform 3 weeks ago. She knew what it was now. It was recognition. Not of her face, or her name, or her position. Something prior to all of that. Something that had been waiting in him for 8 months, the same way it had been waiting in her, and that the threshold space, with all its barriers stripped away, made impossible to qualify or contain. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, rougher. The threshold space altered sound. She was hearing him across a boundary, and the boundary changed the quality of it, the way depth changed the quality of water. "You're not wrong," Isolde said. "We can discuss it later." The bond between them in the threshold space was not the managed, peripheral, carefully distanced thing she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. It was the full weight of it, direct and unmediated, and it moved through the connection she'd opened with a force that she suspected would have been overwhelming if she hadn't spent 22 days learning the precise shape of it. He felt it too. She could see it in the way he held himself, the careful management of a man who had been alone in a static space for 3 weeks, with nothing but the echo of a bond he couldn't follow, and was now standing at the source of it. "How long?" he said. 22 days here." She was maintaining the boundary with everything she had, and the effort was visible in her voice, if nothing else. "In the chamber." "I don't know. Maud's records suggest time distorts." "Maud," he repeated. "You found Maud's records." "The restricted archive. Helwys copied them." She pushed harder against the boundary. "I need you to come to the northeast anchor point. In the chamber, it corresponds to what would be the passage behind the Great Hall, the one that runs east of the main hearth." He was already moving. He knew the castle's geometry the way she knew archival notation. Below conscious retrieval, available without effort. He crossed the reflected Great Hall toward the passage she'd described, and she tracked his movement by the bond, which remained oriented as he moved, a line between them that shortened as he approached the anchor point. "The stone was rebuilt?" he asked. "Partially. Enough for the compact to hold the chamber stable." She paused. "Rolf is the one who had it destroyed. We have evidence. Auden has it now." A brief silence. He was in the passage near the northeast anchor point. She could feel the increased resonance of the threshold remnant as he came closer to the aligned position. "Rolf," he said, and the single word carried the specific flatness of a man organizing something very large into a very small container for later use. He wanted the territory fractured. You were the obstacle. She was watching the anchor point in the townhouse floor, where the stone fragment had begun to pulse faintly. The same rhythm as the original, the compact responding to the aligned positions on both sides of the boundary. Cowan was going to be his instrument. Cowan is 17. Yes, that was the appeal. Aldrin said nothing. She heard him breathing on the other side of the boundary, even breaths, controlled, the particular breathing of someone managing a state that would otherwise be difficult to manage. "Your hands," he said. "The cuts." She looked at her palms. The thin lines were warm and bright in the threshold space, visible in a way they weren't in ordinary light. "From the fissure, when I was holding the edge." A pause. "I saw them. Before I fell. I saw what the rim had done." Isolde kept her attention on the boundary and did not say what she might have said if the boundary had not required every available resource to hold. She filed it instead in the compartment that was getting very full and would need to be opened eventually. I'm going to release the anchor, she said. When I do, the compact will push you outward through the northeast point. The fissure won't open. You'll come through the sealed location, and the compact will re-establish fully when you cross. She paused. I don't know exactly what that will feel like. Do it, he said. She released the anchor. The threshold remnant discharged. All of it. The accumulated fragment she'd been carrying for 22 days, directed through the bond and the aligned anchor point in a single sustained release. The pressure in her chest, emptied in a way that was not loss, was the opposite of loss, was the sensation of a tension resolving into the thing it had been tensioned toward. The stone fragment on the townhouse floor flared once, strongly, and went dark. In the original ritual hall, 3 streets northeast, through walls and cobblestones and the sleeping density of the capital city, the compact re-established. She felt it in the absence of the threshold remnant, the way a sound was perceivable in the silence it left behind. Then, Erwin was crossing the ring, and she was on her knees on the townhouse floor without having decided to be there, and he caught her by the arm before she listed further. Still here, she said, because he looked like someone who needed that confirmed. The stone fragment discharged completely, he said. He was looking at the dark anchor point. Did it work? Isolde put her hand flat on the floor. The stone beneath was warm, warmer than it should have been, the warmth of a compact that had just completed a circuit, the same quality she'd felt in the fissure rim that night on the platform. She didn't get to answer. The door opened. He was upright. She would think about that later. The fact that he crossed the city and reached the townhouse and came through the door upright and functional after 22 days in a static confinement space. The wolf in him had been beating against the chamber walls for 3 weeks, and it was still there in the surface of him, visible in the way he moved, the held-back quality of it. He looked at Erwin first. A look that communicated something in the shorthand of people who had worked alongside each other for years. Something that involved a great deal of information, exchanged in no time at all. Then he looked at Isolde. She was still on the floor. This was, she acknowledged, not an ideal position from which to conduct any kind of interaction. But her legs had not yet offered to cooperate, and she had decided not to demand things from her body that it wasn't currently prepared to give. He crossed to her. He came down to one knee in front of her, which brought his face level with hers in a way that recalled the platform and the dust and the specific 2 feet of distance she'd never had with him before, and had not forgotten for 22 days. He looked at her with the recognition she'd seen in the threshold space, and it was different from the outside. Not stripped of complication, not simplified, but present in a way that didn't require the threshold space to remove everything else. Present in ordinary light, in an ordinary room, with Erwin at the perimeter being professionally unobservant. You found Maud's records, he said. I'm an archivist, she said. Finding what had been buried was the work. His mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, the edge of one, the trace of something that would resolve into a smile when there was more time and less immediate aftermath. He took her hands. Both of them, carefully, his thumbs resting over the healed lines on her palms, with an attention that was not casual and not quick. I heard you, he said. In the chamber. I couldn't tell what it was at first. It came through in fragments, but I knew it was from this side. From here. A pause. It was the only thing that changed in 3 weeks. Isolde looked at their joined hands. You knew about the bond, she said. Before the ritual? Yes. For months. Yes. She thought about the receiving chamber. The 3 minutes she'd stood there while he reviewed her document. The way she'd stood in the corridor afterward with her hands shaking and told herself it was nerves, that it was rank, that it was the ordinary response of an ordinary person. I was going to come to you, he said, after the ritual. The ritual was the obligation that had to be completed first, and then... He stopped. She felt the slight tension in his hands. Not publicly, he said. The moment the court understood what you were to me, you would have become leverage. I was not willing to hand them your name to men who would use it before I could secure your position. And then the ritual went differently than planned, she said. Yes, Irwin appeared at Aldrin's shoulder with the timing of someone who had been watching a clock. Auden moved the investigation motion at first light. Rolf is contained. His supporters are already distancing. The vote won't happen. A pause. Helwys is secure. I sent men for her an hour ago. Aldrin rose. The shift was immediate. The full weight of the Alpha King settling back into a posture she recognized from across rooms, from formal processions, from platform distances where she'd kept her eyes down and documented without appearing to observe. Present and absolute and not remotely at odds with what had just happened on the floor. He looked at Irwan. Rolf, detained. Auden's people moved on him this morning when the investigation motion passed. Aldrin nodded once. Then he looked back down at Isolde. She had gotten to her feet while he was talking to Erwin, because the floor had been a fine place to be during the immediate aftermath of discharging a threshold remnant, but was no longer necessary, and she preferred to conduct the remainder of this conversation standing. He looked at her standing, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition of the specific stubbornness that had produced it, and something that might have been appreciation for that quality. The court convenes at midday, Irwan said, with the tactful neutrality of a man performing absolute ignorance of the room's atmosphere. I know, Aldrin said. He did not look away from Isolde. There will need to be a formal address. The vacancy motion, the investigation findings, the counselor's detention. I know, Irwin. A brief pause. I'll be outside, Irwin said, and left. The townhouse was quiet. Outside, the capital was waking into a morning that did not yet know what it contained, that the threshold chamber had closed cleanly, that the compact had re-established, that the man it had been built to hold was standing in a narrow townhouse 3 streets from the original Fisher site, with ink stains from another person's hands on his own from where he'd held them. Aldrin looked at her with the full attention of someone who was done allocating it elsewhere. You woke calling my name, he said. Irwan told me. After the ritual, the first time you came back to consciousness, you were saying my name. Isolde had spent 22 days not letting herself examine that detail too directly. It was easier not to examine it when its subject was absent. I don't remember what I was saying, she said. I woke up and the word was already there. It was my name. So Erwin tells me. He stepped closer. Not quickly. Not without giving her time to hold her ground or step back. And she held her ground because she had not carried a bond through 22 days, and a threshold chamber, and a Lord's receiving room, and a floor-level discharge to step back now. I didn't tell you my name in the hall, he said. I didn't speak to you at all. There wasn't time. No, she agreed. So how did you know it? Isolde looked up at him. The green of his eyes was the same as it had been on the platform, the same as it had been in the threshold space, a color that was darker than it should be. More internal, like something seen at depth. I found it in the archive, she said. Same place I find everything. The edge of a smile again, closer this time. Outside, the city continued waking. Somewhere in it, Lord Auden was presenting an investigation motion. Somewhere in it, Rolf was learning what his preparations had and had not accounted for. Somewhere in the restricted archive, Helwys was being escorted out of a building she'd spent 3 weeks using as a position and would need a significant period of rest to recover from having done so. In the narrow townhouse, Aldrin raised one hand and brushed the edge of her jaw with his thumb, a contact that was brief and deliberate and asked nothing. And she turned her face into it slightly, because the bond recognized it and her body had stopped pretending the bond was something she managed from a careful distance. The court convenes at midday, she said. I know. You need to be there. I will be. He looked at her for another moment. Then he straightened and moved toward the door, and at the threshold, he stopped. Isolde, he said. She looked at him. After the court, he held her gaze. You and I are going to have a conversation that I should have started 8 months ago. She thought about the receiving chamber, the reviewed document, the corridor afterward, the shaking hands, the 8 months of telling herself it was rank and nerves and reasonable responses to proximity. Yes, she said. We are. He left. She stood in the center of the cleared floor, the spent anchor points around her feet, The morning light through the south-facing window falling across the table where 4 days ago she'd organized evidence into 3 categories and written lists in 2 scripts. The pressure in her chest was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that didn't pull or disorient or require management. It simply existed, steady and directed, like a needle that had finally stopped trembling. She looked at the healed lines on her palms. Then she went to find Helwis. The court convened at midday in the great hall. Isolde stood at the back, near the eastern wall, in the position she had occupied 4 times before as a scribe. Unremarkable, peripheral, present only to document. She had her parchment, she had her quill, she held neither. Aldrin addressed the court for 40 minutes. She had heard formal addresses before, had transcribed 3 of his, had documented the cadence and the structure and the particular quality of authority that a room of 200 people produced when every one of them was oriented toward the same person. She had documented it from the outside with the detached precision of her training, and it had still done something to her attention that she'd told herself was rank. She stopped telling herself that. When the formal address concluded, the vacancy motion struck, the investigation confirmed, Rolf's detention made a matter of public record, the compact's restoration announced without the full detail of how it had been accomplished. Aldrin turned to the court with the specific weight of someone who had one more thing to say. Isolde of the Royal Archive, he said. 200 people looked for her. She was at the eastern wall, underdressed, with healed cuts on her palms and no title worth announcing. She did not move for a moment. Then she walked forward. The court was silent in the way courts were silent when they were paying full attention, and had not yet decided what they were paying attention to. She crossed the floor and stopped at a distance she considered appropriate, and Aldrin looked at her from the dais and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than was strictly formal. The compact holds because of what she carried back from the threshold, he said to the court. The stone was rebuilt because of what she found in the archive. The evidence against the counselor exists because she knew what to look for and how to read it. A pause. Her name belongs in the formal record of these proceedings. Not as a witness, not as a scribe. The court waited. As the person who brought the Alpha King home, he said. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before it. Isolde kept her eyes on him because looking away felt dishonest, and whatever else she was not dishonest. He descended from the dais. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand. Not a formal gesture, not the extended hand of ceremony, but a direct and simple offer, palm up, the way someone offered a hand to someone they intended to stay near. She placed her hand in his. The bond settled into something she didn't have archival language for and didn't need. It was not the pull of an absence. It was not the pressure of something straining against a boundary. It was a weight that had found its counterweight, a direction that had found its destination, a compass at rest. Behind them, the court began to move and speak, the formal session dissolving into the particular noise of people processing information and adjusting their understanding of what had just happened. Erwan materialized at the edge of the dais with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific outcome with more investment than his professional neutrality usually permitted. Helwis stood near the archive entrance, arms folded, looking at Isolde with the expression she reserved for documents that had been restored from damage and had come back complete. Aldrin's thumb moved across the healed lines on Isolde's palm, the same attention he'd given them in the townhouse, deliberate and unhurried, as though the court and its noise were a considerable distance away. The conversation, she said quietly. Tonight, he said. When the hall is empty, and there is no compact to restore, and no vote to delay, and no threshold to hold open. She looked at their joined hands, at the thin lines that had come from holding on as hard as she could at the edge of something that had no bottom. Tonight, she agreed. The great hall continued around them. The afternoon light moved through the high windows and crossed the floor where 3 weeks ago a stone had come apart, and a fissure had opened, and a scribe had grabbed the edge and held on. The floor was solid. The compact held. The hall was full of people who would spend the next weeks and months making sense of what had shifted and what it meant for the territories and the throne and the order of things. Isolde let them. She had a conversation to prepare for, an archivist's instinct to resist over-preparing, and a hand in hers that she had no intention of releasing before she was ready. She was not ready yet.